All right, so I'm going to go through 5 things why I think it's difficult for classically trained musicians to improvise or to even to play jazz, right? So I think the first thing to think about is it's the bigger idea of the jazz process. Like what is the process of music making in a jazz setting versus in a classical setting? So I think Bill Evans says this best.
But jazz, in a way, has resurrected that process, which I call the jazz process. Now, jazz, as we tend to look at it, is a style. But I feel that jazz is not so much a style as a process of making music. It's the process of making music, making 1 minute's music in 1 minute's time. Whereas when you compose, you can make 1 minute's music and take 3 months.
And I think that encapsulates it really well. I think that's the hardest thing. It's this mental model. It's this way in which you fundamentally are making music. So the next thing that I think is the biggest difference is a cultural difference. So if you think about music making in a classical setting, so what things does that community value the most, right? If you start doing classical music, you're probably going to do recitals. You're going to do, maybe, if you're serious about it, piano competitions or some kind of competition where you're learning a piece from the repertoire, like a concerto or a sonata or some piece, right? And you're aiming for technical mastery, reliability of memory, executing a good performance. So stage presence, interpretation of the piece, like those are the things that are going to be valuable in that kind of setting. Whereas think about the situations in which you might hear or participate in jazz music. You're going to go to a jam session like downtown, or you're going to go to a coffee shop, or a restaurant might have a jazz combo there. Something of that form. Like it's much more informal, and there's a repertoire. Like there's standard pieces that they play and that you might know, but the value on like note accuracy is not the same. Like the things that they value in that community are fundamentally not the same. So even if the highest level, say you do like a jazz competition, right? What things do they value? They're not going to value maybe, execution. Like how is your technique? Can you rip through like the Liszt sonata, note perfect and like fast and accurate? It's going to be like, well, what novel ideas can you come up with on the moment? All right, if you look at like the technical proficiency of someone like Thelonious Monk or Horace Silver, they're nowhere on par of like a classical pianist, just in pure, technical ability. So that the things that they're striving for, maybe even at the highest levels, are fundamentally different. So I think if you come from that mindset, it's just a very different shift in ways of making music. So, the jazz process and then culture. And I think everything from there just comes out of those two ideas. And it used to not be that way. So if you look at how classical music was in the 18th and 19th century, you had like the salon culture in Europe, where you would have big parties and gatherings. So I'm thinking of like, the Mendelssohn family, most famous. They would get together and, their friends would bring their compositions that they've written down, or you might want to try something out, or may even improvise. At that time, they also even had improvisation competitions, right, in that style. So you would have heard something maybe akin to like a Mozart sonata or something like that, improvised on the spot. So very, very much maybe like what jazz culture would be today. You get together, a group of people, and you're just going to make music. There are some classical traditions that do still maintain improvisation. The only one I can really think of is organ, playing the organ. And maybe this has its reliance on like the church or something. The setting in which you're going to play organ, you don't know how long you're going to play for. you might need to fill a couple minutes between pieces, or 10 minutes, or play prelude music or postlude. So I know as training of organists, like part of their skill set is you need to be able to improvise, take some idea and run with it for, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, or transition from one piece to another, those kinds of things. So I know it's alive and well in the kind of the organ space. But other than that, you have people here and there, but it's not trained or valued as a discipline in and of itself. Groove is really important in playing jazz. Like, can you maintain this cadence with a drum player? Do you have a sense of rhythmically what the form is? Is it a 12-bar blues or, a 16-bar song? Like, do you have a sense of what the rhythm is? And can you feed off of what the drum player is doing? As opposed to the way you would process time in classical music, it's very different. So like playing a Chopin nocturne or something, there's this kind of ebb and flow of the time, what we would call rubato, which you don't really have that sense in jazz music. Maybe a ballad, you can be a little more elastic, or you hear these long intros of like Bill Evans. This sense of time is maybe more classical, but certainly in any kind of group making process, as a jazz musician, you're feeling time like fundamentally in a different way than you would as a classical music, maybe even playing with other people, like in an orchestra or a piano trio or something. It's just a very different feeling of how you process time. Okay, the next thing would be the repertoire. So classical music, they didn't have recordings 200 years ago, so it was all written down, which I think if you think about it, it's kind of cumbersome. It takes lots of time. If you've ever tried to write a piece down, it takes time, and it takes time to clearly communicate your ideas about the music you're trying to convey. So even like say if you look at a Beethoven sonata, I mean, scholars debate all the time, well, what does this little mark mean here and there? And sometimes, like, we don't know, what did Beethoven really mean by this? We can make a best guess. It'd be much more helpful if we had a recording of Beethoven himself playing it. But some people feel that's like beside the point, like the music has moved beyond that, and now the written form is actually like the canonical source. Whereas in jazz music, we have these recordings to rely upon. So about 1920s-ish, recording technology became stable and reliable enough that we could record jazz musicians, and that kind of became canonized, right? You have these recordings of Thelonious Monk or Charlie Parker that we can now refer to. We don't have to write it down. So in a lot of sense, the jazz music has arisen from like an oral tradition, like a mouth-to-mouth or ear-to-ear kind of experience where you listen, you try to incorporate what the people before you have done, and then you try to move it forward or expand and make it your own. So that's kind of like organic process. Whereas in classical music, it's been written down. It was written down. You'd pass along the Bach pieces or Mozart from generation to generation. You'd rely on that score, and each generation would have a different take on that. But they couldn't really stray from the notes per se, but maybe how you might realize a trill, for example, right? The little things like that. So the canonized repertoire, I feel, is really the recordings for jazz. And I feel today, if the composers of the past, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, if they had access to recording technology, what that documented clearly their ideas, I don't know why they would bother to write it down, right? It takes so long and it's so tedious to write down, certainly to write down like a whole symphony. It takes a long time. Not to say that people don't do that today. I just wonder though, like what they would have done? Would they have chosen to just record their improvisations and be done with it, right? So I don't know. It's just an interesting thought that recording has drastically changed how we make music today. And the last thing I want to cover is notation. So in the past, in the Baroque era, they had a shorthand for describing, a general framework for improvisation or the form of a piece, right? When they used figured bass, it was a bass line and then little number symbols. And this would be all the information that a group would need to play from. You could have a keyboard player and a basso continuo player play off of this kind of like framework. That's kind of dead. Like I don't want to say nobody. A lot of people don't use that today. You might see it in a university setting where you're actually learning about figured bass and you might write it out. But as a practice of let's improvise off of this, and you show up someplace and they just hand you, a figured bass or a basso continuo part, and you have to play that live in some setting, is pretty unheard of. Whenever I've been to a gig like that, usually it's all like written out for me, right? Like my note choices are already made. So it's not really improvisation at that point. The jazz equivalent of that is a lead sheet. So it's kind of the opposite. It's melody. They give you the melody, and then they give you the chord symbols. So that is like the thing that you would have to learn if you're transitioning, how to realize these chord symbols. And there's no like one canonical version, right? So if you take the real book, some of the tunes in there, then chords are going to be changed. You have a whole art of chord substitution. So anyway, it's just kind of like a rough framework or a way to a shorthand for writing down a tune, and then you could give it to a group and they would know what to do with it. So anyway, those are 5 things that I think make it difficult for a classically trained musician to play jazz.